Hi everyone, welcome back to Love and Philosophy. This is Andrea Hiott, and I am glad you're here. Today I am talking with Mark Solms. He has been on the podcast a few times before. He's a neuropsychologist and a psychoanalyst from South Africa. He's actually one of the founders of neuropsychoanalysis, and he's also holding the chair of neuropsychology in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town. And we've also talked about his neuroscience work in brain mechanisms of dreaming. Some of you might not know, but he has revised the standard edition of the complete psychological works of Freud. He has translated the revised standard edition. He's retranslated it. So that's 24 volumes. Can you imagine? He's been working on it for about 30 years. So this is a real labor of love. And he's also now working on Freud's neuroscientific works, which is, I think, 4 volumes. So this is amazing, actually. This is a project of a lifetime. And that he's actually also done all this work in dream science and neuropsychoanalysis, and it's quite something, actually. I'm just realizing as I try to say it all in the intro, but he also has another book out. It's called The Only Cure. It's out this week. That's why we're having this little talk. Or that's why I'm putting it out this week for him. So you can look for his book, The Only Cure. Hope you'll check it out. And actually, this conversation is really interesting, thinking about what a cure means. Thinking about this whole chemical imbalance thing that I hear people say it all the time. As you will hear us talk about here, it's really not about dopamine and serotonin in the way that everyone's assuming. And this whole chemical imbalance story needs some correction. So I hope you'll at least listen to that part and look at some of the literature for yourself in the show notes and see what you think about it. We also talk about Freud, of course, who is a controversial person. There's a lot more to him than I knew reading this book. I definitely started to realize how much he actually can resonate towards a lot of embodied literature, which was very surprising for me. We talk about that here. Also thinking about memory and different sort of systems and the ways he was studying it, I found very interesting. Maybe Freud was even one of the first functionalists. I mean, we could go on and on like this, and of course there's a point where Freud wasn't everything, but it is, I think, worth rethinking the way he has gotten discarded, and especially when you start to understand that he was actually doing neuroscience before that word came into being. We also, of course, talk about dichotomies and moving beyond them and holding paradox and all the usual themes. Navigational mind is in here too. So settle in and stay with us, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Mark. We end up at love at the end. The last chapter is that love is the cure, or the cure of love. And I actually think that's the real answer. It's not an easy answer. It's a lifetime of hard work and doing these labors of love and trying to be better selves, because it's a different quality of life, actually, if you can forgive yourself and feel love for yourself and the world. And I know you can. Okay. Hi, Mark. It's so wonderful to see you again. Welcome to Love and Philosophy.
Thank you. Great to be back.
So we're going to talk about your new book. And in this book, you say that there might be no one alive who's spent more time with Freud than you have. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I think that's a fair statement. You know, the reason for that is that I began translating Freud's neuroscientific works in the late 1980s. And I did a draft version of them by the time that I was asked to take over the revision of the translation of his psychological works. I then spent 29 years on that second task, and I've now, since those works came out, which was a few years ago, I've returned to finishing the translation of Freud's neuroscientific work. So, you know, you can see it's been decades, and decades of what? Of reading each and every sentence and asking myself the question, what is the thought that is captured in these German words, so that I can convey that same thought in English words. I think that counts as having spent more time with Freud's mind than anyone else alive today. I'm quite sure of that.
Maybe even than Freud himself spent with his own life. So I want to ask you about this book and how you ended up deciding to call it The Only Cure. Cure is probably the most important word there, but I'm wondering when the title came, if you thought of that towards the end, or if you were always thinking of it in this way through the cure lens.
Well, it came at the end, and the way that it came about was that I wanted to call it, when I thought about the title, which was at the end, I wanted to call it The Cure. And my publisher pointed out that's the name of a punk rock band, so it's taken. And they suggested The Only Cure. And I think that what you just said is quite right. The emphasis falls on the word cure. And what I mean by that is a treatment which is directed at the cause of the difficulty rather than the symptom. One doesn't cure symptomatically; one cures causally, and so that's why the emphasis falls on that word.
Yes, more curative than palliative. We can get into that. But first, this is a pretty weird juxtaposition for some people, that this book is actually reintroducing us to Freud in many ways. You spent all this time with Freud, and then cure. I think a lot of people have dismissed Freud, and they definitely wouldn't say that a book about Freud could be called anything relative to curing anything. So how can we start to unpack that and understand how very misunderstood Freud is for most of us?
So the impetus to this book, again, I have to invoke my publishers. The impetus to this book was that I had finished the revision of the translation of Freud's psychological works. And, that was, I'm sorry if this sounds like I'm bragging, it's not me, but it was a big event. Freud's works in English is a literary event when they come out. And so the publishers said, this is too good an opportunity. The eyes of at least a portion of the world are now directed to Freud and what he wrote and so on. This is an opportunity to write something yourself about Freud. And I thought they were right. It is an opportunity. If you, as I am keen on Freud and you want Freud's ideas not to disappear, then you should take such an opportunity. And I thought the opportunity that really what was not an opportunity to write about the translation of Freud, because that's a very obscure topic, but rather translation in the sense of how would we say in modern language what Freud was trying to convey to us. I think a lot is lost in the sort of arcane nature of this technical vocabulary. And once you strip it of all of that kind of jargon, the ideas are rather straightforward. And what I wanted to do was translate them not only into modern language, but much more importantly, to see how well do they stand up. We convert them into the modern equivalents, the modern term, using the terms and the concepts that would be the modern equivalents, then are these ideas valid or not? So that's what the book is about. Now, to answer your question, when you do that and you look at these ideas and compare them to how we think about the big picture of how the instrument of the mind is put together in modern cognitive and affective neuroscience, the thing that stands out is how remarkably prescient those ideas of Freud's were. I mean, I could give you many examples of it, but it really is, unmistakable that the overarching picture that Freud described, it's not something that we've gotten over and moved on from. It's something that we've kind of caught up with, and that's the surprising message or a large part of the message of the book, is that this is not somebody, who we should relegate to the ash heap of history at best, because in fact, people don't even want to do that. They just want to cancel him. I think that it really is the case that Freud, studying the what makes us tick from the perspective, which was the only one available to him, of being the mind. What can you learn about how it works from the subjective point of view? That since we now have tools to study the same part of nature using objective measures, from the outside rather than the inside, uh, it seems as if the inferences, the general conclusions that were derived from those two different perspectives kind of join up in the middle. And I think that's quite something. It's a sort of a validation of Freud's ideas that people using different methods and pursuing an entirely independent research agenda have basically come to the same big picture conclusions.
Yes, this show I'm always talking about holding paradox and trying to, especially with words like subjective and objective. And I really found your introduction of Freud doing that in a important way. Often with Freud, it's about the talking cure. But the cure that you're really getting to and talking about here is actually one that really needs a lot of attention today, because we've decided everything is a chemical imbalance, for example, that's still stuck in most people's head, and that to cure is to find the right medicine. But before we get into that, I also think it's very important that people know that Freud was actually a neuroscientist before that there was neuroscience. But is that fair to say? Would you say he was one of the early neuroscientists?
Yes, it comes as a surprise to many people, if not most people, exactly for the reason that Freud's neuroscientific works have not been translated into English. So, the academic world is dominated by the English language, and if your works are not available in English, then nobody reads them. So that's why I'm translating them. What needs to be said on that score is, first of all, Freud was indeed a neuroscientist, although the word neuroscientist didn't exist. The field certainly did under other names. Freud was, first of all, an histologist. That is, he was studying the cellular structure of the nervous system, and he made contributions to what is now called neuron theory. In other words, he was one of the pioneers who helped us to discover that the elements of the nervous system are neurons. That wasn't known in the 1870s, which is when Freud started working in that area. Then he became an anatomist. A morphologist studies the fundamental tissues. But then Freud studied the connection between these cells in the spinal cord of some lowly vertebrates. Then he moved up to the brain stem and to human material. In fact, he studied the brains of human fetuses because the connectivity is easier to see before it's all fully matured. And then he moved up to the forebrain and to movement disorders, and therefore to clinical neurology. So from neurohistology to neuroanatomy to clinical neurology. By the way, when he was studying the brainstem, he made, again, fundamental contributions, like, for example, any medical student learns the cranial nerves. There's this set of the nerves, that sensory and motor nerves that go into the brainstem. Freud described the origin of one of those. So, it's like basic contributions. When it came to movement disorders, he studied mostly cerebral palsy. And then he moved up to the cortex proper. And now we're in the 1890s. And there Freud studied the brain mechanisms of language. And his greatest contribution to neurology was a book he wrote in 1891, in which he made two interrelated points. The one was that language is a psychological function. So even though language breaks down due to damage to the tissues of the brain, in order to understand or even describe what you're seeing with these patients, you have to use psychological concepts, linguistic concepts. You have to speak about the phonology and the semantics and the lexicon and so on of these patients. You have to say, because that's what is affected. It's the psychological function. Now, that was an innovation to describe the disorders not in anatomical sort of sensory motor terms, but rather in linguistic terms. And then the second innovation was to say that therefore what we're dealing with is not the structure of the brain per se. I mean, of course, these patients have damage to the structure, but you are dealing with its functions. One of its functions is language. And so Freud introduced this concept of the language apparatus. That's what he called it, Sprachapparaat. And that it was a novel concept, the idea of there being a functional organization, which clearly laid the foundations for what he later called the Seelenapparat, the mental apparatus, the apparatus of the mind as a whole. And I want to quote, sort of from memory, so paraphrase what Freud said, just so that people understand what's meant by this functional organization. Freud said that the relationship of the function of language to that of the elements of the nervous system is the same as the relationship between a poem and the letters of the alphabet. He said that the letters of the alphabet are rearranged according to entirely different demands, entirely different principles in order to generate a poem. And to analyze a poem, you don't use the letters of the alphabet. You use these higher organizational principles, the principles that give rise to poetry. So I think that's a beautiful analogy for how Freud moved from being an anatomist to being a psychologist who studies the functions of the brain rather than its structure. And that clearly created the opening for Freud to do the same thing with what are nowadays called functional neurological disorders, those days called hysteria and neurasthenia, where there is no damage to the tissues of the brain. Freud, as a neurologist, could just say, well, fine, we study the function, same as we do with language. And that was the breakthrough to psychoanalysis. So I hope that what I've conveyed is, first of all, Freud made substantial contributions to neuroscience over a substantial period of time, 23 years, in fact. And that the work that he did there was not external to what he did later. It was clearly laying in a very systematic fashion, laying the foundations for psychoanalysis, which is, I'll put it like this. I sort of said the same thing a few minutes ago. It's studying the same thing as we study in cognitive and affective neuroscience. We're not studying neurons. We're studying what they do, what functions they perform. And so we study things like the memory systems and the language systems and perceptual systems and executive systems. These are systems, they're abstractions, they're virtual things. Actually, that's another wonderful way Freud put it. He said that mental functions are not located in the elements of the nervous system, but rather, as it were, between them. And then he said they are virtual things. So this virtual thing, the mental apparatus, the instrument of the mind, this functional organization with organizing principles that Freud was trying to infer. What are these regularities that govern the life of the mind? That underlying apparatus is the same thing that we study from the point of view of anatomy and physiology, via the anatomical and physiological observational perspective. We're studying the same thing in cognitive and affective neuroscience. So I think I've lost track of what your question was, but that's the answer.
No, that was perfect. And actually that betweenness is sort of what I was talking about with this holding beyond dichotomy, holding paradox, because it's not that we dissolve one into the other. It's somehow being able to respect both of these. And I think subjective and objective science and personal lived experience, these kinds of things come up a lot in interesting ways in the way that you write the book. But two things I wanted to also mention memory and how I think we often think of Freud as like conscious, unconscious, and gets very caricatured. But it's really interesting how you bring out in the book that this is actually early ways of thinking about what memory is and how the body is remembering in ways that we consciously don't access with our mind all the time. And that like thinking of it like that becomes really important, I think, in getting out of some of the caricatures relative to conscious, unconscious related to Freud. Also, I wanted to say that you relate the philosophy here in a very interesting way. I know you're sort of more Spinoza oriented, or actually Mark Solms oriented, that happen to be Spinozian, but with the dual aspect monism. But you also talk about functionalism, for example, and the way you were just describing it. There's a whole lot of what ends up being philosophically sort of functionalism in early Freud. But also to just go back to that holding paradox, you also talk, I mean, he feels like an embodied philosopher or an embodied, this 4E tradition feels really rich here. And even phenomenology that's holding what we try to categorize as opposites in a very different way. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, everything you've just said makes sense to me and is music to my ears, because that's exactly the sort of thing that I myself, concluded. You remember the exercise was one of, let's strip this of its 19th century and early 20th century sort of jargon, and let's just see what are the actual ideas that are being conveyed here, and then look at them through the lens of 21st century science and philosophy. What do we, how what do we think about these ideas in relation to the ideas that sort of dominate today? And in doing that exercise, you observe things like functionalism, which is attributed to Hilary Putnam in the 1950s. Freud is clearly, explicitly articulating this approach in the late 1890s. And in 1900, he said almost exactly this. Again, I'm quoting from memory, so it's slightly paraphrased, but he said, I'm aware that this method of dissection, and by that he meant dissecting the function. He said, I'm aware that this method of dissection is a scientific novelty, but I can see no harm in it, as long as we don't confuse the scaffolding for the building. And I thought that was, again, a wonderful phrase. So there he's explicitly saying, I know this is a novelty. I know we don't normally dissect the function, we dissect the structure. And it makes for this very important way of conceptualizing the relationship of mind to brain, which, as you say, is a non-reductive one, which where, these are just two aspects, two perspectives upon one and the same thing, which is neither physical in the sense of anatomy, nor psychical in the sense of a subjective experience, but rather the underlying thing that generates both and explains both of these sets of phenomena. And then you spoke about memory as an example of that. Freud said, well, when you look at the function of memory, from the only perspective he could, which was the subjective one, listening to people's accounts of what they remember of how it is that they came to be the way that they are. What is it that constitutes their minds? Freud observed, well, there's a hell of a lot of things that constitute their mental organization that they don't seem to remember, like the first few years of life and so on. Anyway, in the context of all of that, Freud said, it seems they're multiple memory systems. And he said, again, I'm paraphrasing what he wrote in 1896, this was, he said, I'm working on the hypothesis that memories are not encoded once, but many times over. They are transcribed and retranscribed in different formats over multiple memory systems in an ongoing dynamic way. Now, that is absolutely the modern view of memory. The multiple memory systems model is attributed to Tolman, again, decades after Freud. And to add insult to injury, Tolman was a bloody behaviorist, So Freud clearly explicitly introduced the idea of multiple memory systems, which is a bog standard way of seeing how memory, and it was a radical idea when Freud introduced it, completely and utterly novel idea. And Freud went further and he said, I don't know how many such systems there are, but there must be at least 3 of them. And that's where he spoke of a conscious memory system, a pre-conscious memory system, and an unconscious one. So again, these are these hackneyed old terms, the system, pre-conscious and whatnot. But what Freud actually is saying is there's a system which holds what you're currently thinking in consciousness. That's what we nowadays call the short-term memory system. Then there is the system where memories are stored in a long-term format. Even though you're not currently remembering them, they're there, accessible to you, and you can pull them into short-term memory, into consciousness. We call that the declarative memory system. It's exactly the same as Freud's pre-conscious. And the third memory system, the unconscious one, the memories that you cannot retrieve, that although they have causal consequences, these learned influences, they affect what you do, you're not aware of them. These Freud called the unconscious memory system, and nowadays we call it the non-declarative memory system. And so just as Freud surmised, not only are there multiple memory systems, but basically there are three, the same three that Freud inferred. I mean, this is what I mean when I say, when you map the two sets of concepts onto each other, the inferences, the conclusions, rather than the words, you find this remarkable confluence. And then comes the other thing that you were saying, implicit in this, is that part of our mental processing is unconscious. When Freud introduced that idea, it was really considered an oxymoron. How can you speak of unconscious mental processes? That's like speaking of unconscious consciousness. That was how it was seen, because the word mental and conscious were considered synonymous. And Freud made a major departure from conventional wisdom, in saying, well, that may be so, but unfortunately we're going to have to change it, because there clearly are memory processes, decision processes, desires, beliefs, etc., of which we have no awareness, but they influence what we do. That again is 100% mainstream view today. Then it was considered ludicrous to claim such a thing. Now it is the mainstream view. I don't know of a single cognitive neuroscientist who disputes the fact that great swathes, in fact, the bulk of our cognition goes on unconsciously. And, and I can go on, again, linking up with what you just said, that these unconscious learnt influences upon our behavior and our mental constitution, they go under the heading of what we nowadays call embodied cognition. So Freud made the point that these memories, you can't remember them because they're not encoded in a format. Literally, they're encoded in a way that is not images that you can bring to mind. So Freud said, they're not remembered, they're repeated. There was a famous paper of his, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, where he says conscious and pre-conscious memories are remembered. They are mentally imaged. And then the unconscious ones are repeated. They are enacted. And you spoke of enactivism, that's a Freudian idea. And there you have the basis for the whole talking cure, where we look at transference. We look at what the patient does rather than what they remember, because they can't remember these things. But you can draw to somebody's attention what they're doing, because they're doing it now. And, so there you have it. I'm sorry, I really am. One of the problems with psychoanalysts is when they sit behind the couch, they're supposed to keep relatively quiet. So when you let us loose, we can't stand up.
It's that whole control thing. But no, I love all that you're saying. And actually, there's too many exciting things in there for me, because in one way I want to go and ask you about why. Have you ever read Merleau-Ponty, for example, who was also really involved in psychology? And the way you're talking about repetition and habits and so on, I see a really rich connection there. And I wonder, if what most 4E people would say about Freud being kind of an early one of them. I mean, that's a really interesting, crazy kind of thought that I would like to explore too. But also I want to get at what's really happening here. I mean, maybe I want to talk about transference a little bit, but also, so you're talking about memory and the body and self and the I, and there's all these things in terms of control, really, and access. And I guess what I want to get into is these aren't separate things. Trying to kind of understand that better or clarify that can help us with the homeostasis, I guess, help us flow better. How to do that has been really hard and contested. And so Freud was trying to do it from the science way, if we go with these binaries, and there were blocks, right? There was just not much he could do. He had all these ideas that obviously would come to fruition, as you've just expressed, but the equipment, let's say, to kind of really look into the body in a deep way was still catching up. So he turned to what he did have, which was we might call subjective experience or report or conversation or these many different things. And today, that is not taken seriously, right? Like even in 4E traditions, a lot of that is trying to bring the subject back into science, even phenomenology, right? That's the point. That's been a real struggle. And science has sort of taken over in the sense of using the tools that have now developed in the meantime. So I'm saying all this because something like depression or something like what Freud was really trying to help us cure is now considered something you would treat with medicine. And that's sort of the standard. And we don't take seriously the subjective experience. And is that why Freud has sort of gotten relegated away? And what role do you see, like, how does that need to change? Because this book is really trying to do something very different in that it's not rejecting either of these. It's showing that they're not separable. So just that subjective contribution, I'd like to get into a bit and how we've somehow mischaracterized that over these years.
So, starting with your comment about these two perspectives being inseparable, that it's not an either-or dichotomy. It's not a matter of one either is on the team of the materialist scientists, or one is on the team of the sort of Geisteswissenschaften or the humanities or something. I think that as perspectives on what human beings are, clearly you need both. And this goes back to what you alluded to earlier in terms of dual aspect monism. But just to be a little more concrete about it, first of all, people don't realize this. Freud recommended in the 1880s a stimulant, a drug that could be a valuable antidepressant. In the 1880s, there were various tranquilizers that were already available, like bromides and so on, but there were no stimulants. And Freud suggested as a psychiatric treatment that people should try cocaine. Now, as it happens, that has its downside, and Freud got himself into a little bit of a pickle in doing so. But the point that I'm wanting to make is that Freud was not averse to recommending psychopharmacological interventions. And then, as you correctly say, in those days, and I really want to pause to emphasize this because it is so hard for us to get our heads around, there were no methods for studying the living brain. The only way to study the brain was at autopsy. When the patient was dead, you would take their brain out of their skull and you would have a look. Where was the damage? Where was the disease process that produced what we saw during life? And when it comes to psychiatric disorders, there is no damage. So it is nothing to see. So what Freud did was the only way forwards. The only way that you could possibly understand what was going on was to study the functioning of the brain, if you want to call it that, the functioning of the mental apparatus from the viewpoint of the being of such an apparatus, the experiencing of it. And that was psychoanalysis. Now, you say, why did things go so badly wrong? It's because the other approach gradually became viable. We started to get, starting with the EEG, the electroencephalograph, which was developed actually right in the very last years of Freud's life. But then because of the war, it wasn't scientifically exploited until the 40s and 50s in particular. In the 50s, The EEG was all the rage, and there we were starting to be able to see something about the activity of the living brain and correlate it with what the patient's doing. So it's starting with, oh, I see now they're unconscious, the brain waves are slow. Now they're conscious, the brain waves are fast, and so on. Um, and a whole lot more. And then slowly we started introducing imaging techniques, culminating in functional imaging techniques, like fMRI and positron emission tomography and so on, and transcranial, and all kinds of things. Now we've got this endless tools. I mean, even optogenetics, where you can actually activate an individual memory trace, and see the thing, literally the neurons light up. So all of these tools became available. And I think, given what I said to you about Freud, what he would have said was great. Let's use, let's join the dots. But no, that isn't what happened. The psychology, the people who took the sort of psychological approach thought, oh well, this is right-wing materialist stuff, and we're going to have nothing to do with it. And vice versa. Those who were developing these physical methods were saying, well, that's hocus pocus, all of this psychobabble and subjective nonsense. And so, they didn't actually collaborate. As I say, Freud would have most certainly taken the opportunity to do. And what is more, having the objective correlates of subjective phenomena makes it less worrying to be studying subjective phenomena. The problem with subjectivity is, hello, it's subjective, so there's only a single observer. But if you can simultaneously make objective observations of what's going on in the brain while the person's saying, I'm experiencing this, then the subjective data is kind of tethered to the objective data, and one can be less nervous about using it. And so what I want to conclude this little diatribe with is the following, that if you only study the thing objectively, there are things you can't see. There are phenomena, very important phenomena, that help us to understand how the brain works, like feelings that you can never see with your eyes or hear with your ears. You might see indirect manifestations of them in the form of facial expressions or whatever, but the actual perception, empirical observation of a feeling can only ever happen through introspection. You can only feel your own feelings. And so, to observe, to include in your data, as it were, as to what's causing this person to behave in the way that they are. If you leave out the subjective determinants of behavior, you're going to you're leaving out half the information that you need in order to understand why this person's doing what they're doing. In my case, if you leave out my feelings, you'll never understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. For the most part, all of us, what we're doing is trying to make things better for ourselves, and trying to avoid making things worse for ourselves, all of which boils down to feelings. And so, it has causal consequences, is what I'm saying. Feelings and other subjective states have causal consequences for what we do, and to generalize from that, the brain, how it behaves, what it does physically, you can't understand without including, the subjective determinants of what it does. Subjectivity, feelings evolved for good reason. There's not just some sort of, add-on thing. I'm saying that we need to take both perspectives into account. Freud had no choice but to incorporate the subjective perspective, or to rely on the subjective perspective. But as we developed the objective perspective, the objective methods, so we eschewed the subjective as if that's old hat. We don't need that anymore. And what I'm saying is that's not true. You're going to be grossly misled if you do that. Now, sorry, I'm speaking too much again, Andrew, but you spoke of this chemical imbalance thing, and I really need to talk about this because it's a very damaging myth that the public has not only bought into, that it's been sort of imposed on them. As the idea that what lies behind, let's use depression, which is the most common example, that depression is a chemical imbalance. I mean, this is said time and time and time again, and it's just not true. It's just not true. Both conceptually, it's incoherent to say that, and empirically, it's demonstrably not true. So let me just first of all say what I mean by conceptually, it's incoherent. Imagine you have chest pain and you go to your physician and you say, whenever I exert myself, I have pain in my chest. Um, and the approach of the physician is, okay, well, take this painkiller. You know, that first of all is rather worrying, because symptoms are symptomatic of something. You want to know what's causing the pain. In the case of this chest pain called angina, and what's causing it is that the heart muscle is demanding more oxygen than the arteries can supply, and so that is felt as pain. The muscle is not getting the oxygen that it needs, and the causal treatment for that is you must improve the supply, the blood supply. You must either bypass the blocked coronary arteries, or you must stent them. Now, if the physician simply said, well, take this painkiller, that's bad enough. Okay, that's not looking to the cause. It's just looking, how do I get rid of the symptom? But worse than that, what's happened in psychiatry, now let's say the painkiller is an opiate, okay? Opiates, they increase the availability of mu opioids, these molecules at the receptor. So you give the drug, the painkiller, it takes the pain away, and then worse, the physician then says, now I know what causes chest pain. It's a deficiency of opioids in the heart. That is the conceptual structure of the argument. You give SSRIs, you give Prozac, it increases serotonin. Therefore, the cause of depression, because the serotonin makes you feel a bit better, the cause of depression must be a shortage of serotonin. It's completely idiotic. Now, when you look at it empirically, you can test that. Is that true? So what do? Well, for one thing, you can suck all the serotonin out of somebody and see, does it make them depressed? And it doesn't. You can, through tryptophan, which is the precursor of serotonin, you can deplete the brain of serotonin, and it simply does not cause depression. Then you can look at using these wonderful imaging techniques I mentioned earlier. You can look at how much serotonin is circulating in the depressed brain and the non-depressed brain, and it's the same amount. And you can count the receptors for serotonin. You can see, are there more in the non-depressed brain than in the depressed brain? No, they're not. Is there a difference in terms of the genes that produce these serotonin molecules and receptors? No, there's no difference, etc., etc. I can go on. So there's been an umbrella analysis of all of the data relevant to the claim that depression is a serotonin deficiency, a chemical imbalance, and the data speaks loud and clear. It just says, sorry, not true. So it's conceptually incoherent, and it's empirically unverifiable. In fact, it's empirically disprovable. This idea, that the cause of depression is a chemical imbalance is nonsense. And by the way, anyone who knows anything about the brain mechanisms of feeling would know that it's a nonsense. How it all works is that feelings are deviations. I mean, bad feelings are deviations from where we need to be. So like I said about the heart muscle, it needs a certain amount of oxygen. If you're not getting that oxygen, you feel bad in a particular way. You get chest pain. If you don't eat, you get hunger. If you don't drink, you get thirst. If you don't sleep, you get tiredness. These feelings are symptomatic of a need not being met. And the same applies to emotional needs. Things like fear. Fear is, I have a need for safety. If I'm not safe, I feel fear. Attachment bonding. I need my caregiver close to me, looking after me and attending to me and worrying about me and being available to me. If they're not, you have separation distress. These are emotions, but they're just the same as these bodily feelings. Rage. I need to not have frustrating impediments, things standing between me and the things that I need to get to. If there's somebody preventing me from getting what I need and want, from preventing me from getting my fair share, that's a biological problem. If You've got to get rid of this thing. And so you feel irritated, frustrated, angry, enraged, and you attack. So emotions work in exactly the same way. Now, my point is that the whole task of mental development, we were talking about memory earlier, the whole task of memory, of learning, is learning how to meet your needs. It's as simple as that. That's so. If you have learned how to meet a need, you don't feel bad because that need is being satisfied. If you have not learned how to meet a need, you feel bad. That's the symptom. So here we come to the main point I'm trying to make. If you want to treat the symptom, you take away the feeling, and that's fine, but you haven't actually met the underlying need. So you stop the symptomatic treatment, the symptom will come back again because the thing that's generating it is still there. Talking therapy is aimed at helping the patient to find better ways of meeting their emotional needs. I mean, I'm sort of putting it very simply, but it's not an inaccurate statement. That the aim of talking therapy is to help the patient to find better ways of meeting their emotional needs. First of all, by becoming aware of the ways in which they're doing it now, because as we were saying earlier, it's for the most part not conscious. And problematizing that, and that creates an opportunity to come up with. So the point is that that's treating the cause. What causes the feeling is that the way in which you're going about meeting the need is not working. It's the same as what I was saying about the coronary arteries. That's what you need. Your intervention needs to be at that level, at the level of what it is that's causing the feeling. And so the public has been sold an untruth, that these disorders, you can call them disorders, but in a language, that's just how your life has turned out. It's hard to learn how to meet all your emotional needs. They conflict with each other. They conflict with the needs of other people. It's hard. It's easy to learn how to eat and breathe. These are inert substances just waiting for you to imbibe them. But other people are not so easy to predict. And so it's not so easy to get other people to do what you want them to do in relation to your needs, because they've got needs of their own. So, it's hard. The great task of mental development, as I said earlier, is learning how to meet your emotional needs, and it's hard. So we get it wrong. And that's what so-called psychopathology is all about. Our patients suffer mainly from feelings. And it's important to understand how feelings work. And I need to just add a footnote, which is we mustn't, it's not really true that these drugs actually take the feelings away. They kind of suppress them partially, and they've got side effects, and then there's also withdrawal effects and so on.
Yeah, I was going to go there too. That's exactly. So we don't have evidence actually that a serotonin imbalance, which is what people think of as a chemical imbalance, is about depression. But we do have evidence that when we manipulate serotonin for short amounts of time, we can relieve symptoms, and it feels like a cure in a short time frame. So I think time is a very important element that you bring in the book. Also, this distinction, which is a little hard to talk about in a general way, but I think we should, because the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine circuit and the way that that's more like bodily, I guess, than what we think of as the PFC or something, this way that we know differently. Like our bodies know a lot that we never are aware of. And you and your work have actually shown a lot of what we're talking about, even that we can't just think of things as chemical imbalances, because what's actually happening with the body itself and the way the brain is working is different than maybe we would have thought, where we just locate certain things in certain parts of the brain. But what I'm trying to get at is that transference, right? It's working in a way in which you can access what you can't access. This is another kind of paradox to hold here. And I think it's very much related to a lot of these paradoxes we're trying to hold, which is that we have come very far. You mentioned Edward Tolman, and I really like Edward Tolman. So I want to just say, yes, he was a behaviorist, but not really. He was really going somewhere else, and he did a lot with memory and thinking about things differently. But someone else like Skinner, who also had a lot of contributions, but in your book, you quote him as saying something like, is it emotions or feelings? I think emotions are the fictional causes that we attribute to behavior. So basically, emotion is just fiction. Um, that is kind of the attitude that accompanied a lot of the technological innovation. And so we just thought, okay, emotions are, and all of this intuitive stuff, that's like some kind of childish thing that we then have to grow out of. And then we learn what's really happening in the body. And then you just correct that. And I'm bringing all this up because I think it's important in the way that Freud's transference is such a huge contribution in not only in what we might think of as that woo kind of way where you're talking, curing people, but also that literally we're discovering how, as bodies in science, as you said, we are so much, we don't know most of what we know, if I can say it like that, or we feel more than we ever know that we feel. And in science, we've come into that understanding now, as you said. But I think a lot of it has come through techniques like what Freud was trying to do with transference. So I wonder what you think about all that, but also if we could get into transference just a little bit here and why that is actually such a revelatory kind of new way of thinking about all of this.
Yes. So first of all, just to pick up this by way of preface, that this talking therapy, which you said, woo, it's so like, really, that's going to cure an illness, but the opposite approach is kind of equally odd if you think about it. Do you really believe that taking a pill is going to change your life? I mean, who you are? You're going to become a different personality because you take a pill every morning. It's equally sort of unlikely, isn't it? And but this talking therapy, the public view is that that's a fluffy sort of thing.
I'm sorry, Mark. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think that's actually important because when you do take a pill or you do take a substance, you do change, but it's the time element.
It changes your state. As you say, it's a time thing. It changes while you're under the influence of the chemical. Yes, it changes your state and then it wears off and then, you're back to who you were. It doesn't change who you are. And it can't. It's in the very nature of these treatments that they can't. And so when you stop the treatment, you come back to being who you are, which is why people don't stop the treatments. And they were never designed to be used in that way. The FDA approves these drugs on the basis of trials that last a few weeks, sometimes a few months at most. So all of the effects of long-term usage, which we've discovered in the case of benzodiazepines and antipsychotics and SSRIs, you can have quite bad withdrawal effects from SSRIs. And, all of this, is not how but it's how they end up being used because they only treat the symptom. But now
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just think that's such an important thing for people who don't know about this, because when you do take a pill or a drug or something, you feel like you've cured something. And so then you think that's what you want to get back. But this never is going to be permanent, and it was never meant to be permanent. And in fact, it starts changing things in your body in a way that actually other adverse effects can come. And you point this out in the book, but I just think for people who haven't studied this, it's such an important thing to understand before you take medicine, which can be helpful, but going into it, think of the time element. But anyway, back to the transference. But that just feels very important.
Thank you. I'm glad that you underscore it. But because you have, I wanted to say something else before I turn to transference, which is that I don't want to leave people with the impression that there is no place in psychiatry for psychopharmacology and that symptomatic treatments are useless things. They're not useless. They're symptomatic treatments. People go through crises. To be helped through a crisis with a pill that, it makes it more bearable. I mean, of course, it's a good thing. Also, there are acute conditions, acute in the sense of emergencies, like suicidality. A patient's suicidal, you need to give them symptomatic relief. You don't have time for the causal therapy. And similarly, there are people who are so depressed that they can't use psychotherapy. They can't even get up in the morning, So the symptomatic treatments have their place, and I've just given some examples there. But there are symptomatic treatments, and this needs to be acknowledged. but there's a place for symptomatic treatments. Now, to come to transference, it's this jargony word, transference. It's actually a whopping big phenomenon that Freud discovered, and that once you see it, it's like, wow, this is all over the place, and it really has powerful consequences in our lives. It is the manifestation of what we've been discussing already. That we have these memory systems, which Freud didn't know this, by the way, that the unconscious memory systems are subcortical. They're not mappings of sensory images like cortical memory systems are, that you can reactivate in the form of images. They are motor policies. They are things that you can only enact. The only way you can remember an unconscious memory is to do it, to enact it. So that's what transference is. Because patients cannot remember, they can't remember, oh, that's how I resolved that problem when I was little. That was how I learned who to attach to and how to get her to pay attention to me. And, all of these sort of things, we've no recollection whatsoever of how we did these things. And by the way, that's another thing we've learned, what Freud called infantile amnesia. The first 2 years of life, the declarative memory systems, what Freud called the preconscious, they are not mature. So you can't lay down in a form that can be retrieved. In the first 2 years of your life, when some very formative things happen in those first 2 years, like what I'm talking about, who I'm going to attach to and in what way, it's called attachment style, it lasts for life. And you have absolutely no idea where it came from, and you have no idea that you're doing it. And some people might recognize what I'm going to say now. In your love life, for example, you keep falling in love with the same kind of twit, and you bang your head against the same brick wall over and over again, and you've no idea why you're doing it. Or you just know, oh my God, it's happened all over again. So this is transference. It's the repetition, the enactment, the doing of the same thing, the enactment of the same action policy, that this is my response. In this situation, I respond like that, and I've no idea that I'm doing it and where it came from. But the treatment is, it creates controlled conditions where you are able to show the person, can you see, you doing this here, there, and everywhere. And and can you see, it seems to be intended to have this consequence. It's an attempt to resolve this conflict or meet this emotional need. And and when you point this out, you also point out, to help the person to sort of like empathize with themselves as to why they're doing it. You say, it makes sense given what we know about your development, that in those circumstances, then that was perhaps the best solution you could come up with as to how to deal with that. But can you see you're still doing it now, and can you see it doesn't work? It's not actually meeting that need. And that is, and that's why you're suffering the feeling that brought you to it. And you don't say it as formulaically as I've just put it now, but that's what is called transference interpretation. It sounds like this woo-woo thing, as we were saying earlier, but it's actually a completely straightforward and obvious thing to do, that you're pointing out to the person what they're doing, and that gives them the opportunity to revise it. You can't come up with better ways of meeting your emotional needs if you're not even aware of the compulsive, automatic ways in which. And when we say unconscious, again, it's a kind of a word that's become a kind of cliche, but you have to remember what it means. It means you are not in charge of it. You're not even aware of it. It's just, happening through you. So to gain control of your own intentionality, to become the person who's making choices rather than just repeating stereotypies, is a very important, that's the essence of the cure. It's to give you more choice and to make you more sort of mindful of what you're doing rather than it just happening to you and through you. That's the essence of what transference is all about. And I say again, it's really all over the place. It's a very robust, very important phenomenon that Freud discovered. I want to just add one other thing. I say in a controlled setting and whatnot. The thing about the psychoanalytical setting is that it's a very artificial situation where, in fact, I can put it like this. One of the reasons we're able to help people is because we don't have to live with them. They come to you for 50 minutes, and during that very limited period of time, you don't react. You don't protect your own interests. You don't say, that's not fair, that's not true. Let me tell you what I think, and so on. Because that's what people do in relationships. They're kind of reacting to each other and trying to look after their own interests and so on. In the analytic situation, it's a completely unsustainable in real life. That all you're trying to do is observe what's going on, not react, but feel that this makes me want to respond in this way. What does it mean about what this person's doing? That's what they're doing, elsewhere. Where they get themselves into the pickles that they do. Yeah, all you do is analyze. In other words, all you do is what you've observed. You say to the patient, "I'm observing this about what you do." Rather than me reacting to it, I give what I think I've seen to the patient to so that they can take ownership, of what it is that they're doing. And for the most part, people are very glad to have this. And it doesn't mean that they can just change it, though. That's the other thing I really need to emphasize about how this treatment works. And why I'm emphasizing it is because one of the problems with the treatment is it takes time. And so the reason for that is that even when you become aware, when it's pointed out, can you see you doing this over and again, it's meant to achieve that, and it isn't achieving that. It's like, oh my God, it's a very important moment because for the first time you understand your own problems, and what is more, you see that to a certain extent it's in your own hands, that you can do something about it. In other words, you can do things differently. There's the problem, that even though you see all of that, you still do it again. This is the thing about transference. When I say it's such a robust phenomenon, you say to the patient, you did it again, and you did it again, and you did it, and eventually the patient says, I did it again. That's because it's unconscious. You're not in control of it. But the crucial moment comes when the patient recognizes, I am doing it again, through becoming familiar with this pattern, with this tendency to act in a certain way, to react in a certain way, because you've seen the pattern time and again in the fashion I've just said. Eventually, you recognize it as it grabs hold of you. You see, I'm doing it again, and then you can change your mind. It's called not free will; it's called free won't. The freedom to choose not to act in this stereotypical fashion and to do something else instead. That's when you don't need the analyst self anymore. Then it's called working through, and then you can carry on working it through yourself. But that process takes time. When it comes to the non-declarative memory systems, what Freud called the unconscious, what we now call the non-declarative memory systems, we have a saying in cognitive neuroscience about one of the core such systems called procedural memory. We say procedural memories are hard to learn and hard to forget. This is why the treatment takes time. You have to repeat over and over again, seeing it again and again and again, in order to change these memory systems. It's just how they work. And I make the analogy in the book, if healthcare funders, were to say to renal patients, sorry, you can't have that much dialysis, it's too expensive. The patient just dies, because that's how the kidney works. It needs that. Now, fortunately, for the very most part, our patients don't die if they don't get the treatment that they need. But their lives are destroyed. Their lives can be, I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but a life can be wasted. And its lives are precious things. Each of us only gets one of them. And so these are weighty matters that we need to provide the treatment, the best treatment that's available. Might be, we as scientists, first of all, are not, our first task is to ascertain what works, not how expensive is it, but what works. And once we've ascertained what works, we can then ask the question, how does that work? Why does that work? Try to identify the active ingredient, so that you can deliver it in the most efficient fashion. But it's a secondary question. What is the cost efficacy? I'm not saying it's a non-question, but it's not a scientific question. And frankly, it's not even a medical question, because the medical question also is, what works best? You need to know that, because your first obligation, is to help your patient. It's a secondary obligation to help the healthcare funder, to deliver affordable treatments. But I'm meandering all over the place, but these are all important things.
They're wonderful. It's just there's so much I want to talk to you about in there, but it makes me think. I mean, habit is a word that is contested, in neuroscience to use, but it reminded me in the book where you talk about Freud sort of anticipated Hebb's neurons that fire together, wire together idea. And I think we can think of this even embodied, like in the way that the body is and the way we have these pattern generators, or these ways that are very, very hard to change, whether it's tacit knowledge or procedural memory or whatever we want to talk about, and how it's actually bodily. In the book, you talk about how when we get in the same emotional state that we were in when whatever occurred, something that's really affected us, then we're more likely to be able to change it, or to kind of maybe bring it into that awareness in the way you just said. And that's such a bodily thing too, that I think feels really important. And you also, you start the book with, is it Teddy? Is that the patient?
Teddy, yes.
Yeah. And that's just one example that came to mind when you were talking of how his whole life, or that person's whole life, could have been just wasted in a way, if it had gone the traditional route, which it was going before he happened to be introduced to you. And then it changed dramatically. So I think the stakes are really high and also really nuanced, such that we would never know that we missed it. And it's so easy to miss. There's something so frustrating in that, actually, that so many people suffer that didn't have to. I'm sort of going on and on too now, but it's because I find this is such an important thing to try to talk about as both scientific and personal. In the book, you do this nested level. I'm thinking about, you talk about your personal life in a way that I haven't really seen you do so much otherwise, like your own dreams, the letter from your father I'm thinking of, that really affected me. Look, he was telling you where he'd hidden his love, and you're trying to, in the dream. But you talk about the personal, but then you also talk about, there's also the social aspect of this. Even what we were talking about with the way we've dismissed Freud, that's almost a collective defense mechanism of society that we couldn't handle. Exactly what we've both been getting into. The stakes are so high here. The bodily feelings and emotion really matter so much, and that we actually have to kind of be in that state. Just to go to that thing I raised about when you're in the same emotional state, that's where the change happens. That we actually have to learn how to live in that weird tension if we want to change things. And that's at the individual level, the science level, the philosophy level, the social level. Were you trying to do that in the book? Is this making sense to you?
Yes. The technical term, by the way, for the thing that you mentioned now and earlier is state-dependent memory. And yes, it's a thing. The bigger point that you're making about the personal and the political alongside the scientific, when it comes to the science of the mind, it's in a way not surprising that, this is not some neutral subject matter out there. This is us. This has consequences for our lives. And which is also why Freud invited quite a lot of resistance. It's because what you're talking about me, you're telling me I function like that. So but more, to the general point that we're discussing now, these things are personal and political. On the personal side, you mentioned that I, what do they call it, disclosed quite a lot about myself and my own development and my own analysis, um, and my own symptoms and all of that. I did that for a good reason. It is, well, for what I hope is a good reason. It's that we're all in the same boat. It's to illustrate the point that I was alluding to earlier when I said, you can call it illness if you want to, but it really is just the way that you've put yourself together over a lifetime. So we are, all of us, struggling to a greater or lesser extent with these tasks that I've said are the great tasks of mental development. Learning how to meet your emotional needs is difficult, and we, all of us, cobble together a kind of a imperfect solution. And so I wanted to show, that this is not something that happens to people out there called patients. It's something that affects us all. And also, because I'm talking about subjectivity in this book, you're the only truly the subject that you truly know is yourself. And so, I think that that's another reason for doing that. But then, as you say, it's not only myself, it's other selves. And I chose the case of Teddy P. I could have chosen, sadly, 100 others like him. It's not unusual what happened to Teddy P. When he had, for perfectly understandable reasons, he fell into a bit of a slump. And next thing, he was in the grip of what we call polypharmacy, where he was being massively over-medicated. It's not rare. And then, half the symptoms were iatrogenic. In other words, there were symptoms caused by the medications that were treating the other symptoms. And then he needed to have other medications to treat the symptoms of, until eventually the guy became completely non-functional. And this is the point you're making. I mean, in the most literal sense, it could have been a life wasted completely, where he was unable to work. He couldn't climb stairs. He had to stay on the ground floor of his two-level apartment. But then to the political, it's not on that we are sold this story that all we need is these pills. It's not on for the reasons that we're just discussing. And where does that come from? It comes from huge corporations making tons of money out of our suffering by delivering treatments. That, as I said earlier, symptom relief is got its place, but these drugs are not being used in that way. They're being used for years, for decades, instead of the actual treatments that we need. Why are the actual treatments that we need not being provided? It's because not only is it hard for us, we also all want magic bullets. Who doesn't? It would be great if you could get something for nothing, but you can't. It requires hard work and takes time to change your life. But it's also because we are told by these drug companies and by the healthcare providers, that the health insurance companies and so on, that these are cures. Well, this is why it's really important that the public understand it's just not true. And we should demand a sea change in terms of what is provided for us. I'm speaking to you as an American. You must remember, in other countries, it's also the state. The state provides in Europe, for example. It's much more common that the average citizen's healthcare is provided by the state, paid for by their taxes. And so, there's a need for voters and consumers in America, to understand what the scientific facts are, so that they can demand better. And it becomes a political issue. The governments, in the case of the European states I'm talking about, they don't care about their citizens enough. This is not a small matter. And I'm mindful of the fact that I have just waved hands about, what works and what doesn't work. So I need to emphasize that there's a whole chapter of the book in which the chapter and verse of the empirical facts, are outlined. I'm talking about randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of how one objectively goes about determining the efficacy of a treatment and the comparative efficacy of different treatments. And, psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And I emphasize that because it's true that, it's not that it's a very cumbersome treatment that takes a lot of time. People don't have that time and they don't have that money and so on. So this thing about identifying the really essential ingredient and seeing, can that be delivered at scale? These are important questions. And so all of the data that we've gathered over decades now of researching what works and what doesn't work and what works for whom, because, there's not one treatment that's for everything. You don't always need a sledgehammer to crack a nut, so all of that's data is outlined in the book. And I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thanks. And also you go into the whole sleeper effect and the science
Yes.
behind it. So there's a lot more, of course, than we can talk about here that is in the book, and also the case studies. And somehow I'm remembering another study you talk about, or another one of your patients maybe, who was telling you their mother is fine when you were asking about the mother who had been really sick. And he's always, she's fine now, she's going back into treatment or whatever. And you knew something was wrong there because she'd been really sick. And then it turned out, of course, that she had actually passed away. So he had sort of slipped into psychosis. But when I was reading that part, I was thinking, that's so irresistible in a way for us, like collectively too. I think in the way you were talking about the drug companies, it sort of made me think it's so irresistible in a way for us to want to just slip into psychosis and believe that what happened didn't happen or something. There's something about that really struck me in the book too, of how, and it has to do also with that short-term effect of drugs and things, that there's a sort of something about time matters very much, I think, in this book and in the way we reconceive of these, what's really happening here, and getting these sort of short bursts of whatever we're getting from, whether it's our politics or social media or whatever. But also, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the more personal stuff you get into at the end of the book, and to how this is happening at nested levels politically too, in ways that are really hard, right? That we also want to go into just believing the mother is still alive, so to speak. So I think there's a lot of work in this. And I guess another thing is you talk about analysis as a sort of trade, or a practical trade in a way. But also it's a lot of work, right? To your point of, we need these drugs. They're important in temporary situations. Context matters so much. Instead of thinking there's one way to ever look at this, we have to somehow start taking context always, and position of the person. There seems like so much work still to be done around that. And thinking of it as almost a practical trade feels kind of helpful, because then it's like a lifetime thing that you're doing, and it becomes about how you're attending to what is with you and in front of you. And I wonder if that feels close to you in any way, in terms of the way you know Freud better than anyone, because you've really spent time. That's very hard to translate, right? And to spend so much time with this text. Also, I think you don't always agree with Freud. So that must be a weird tension, to be the translator and then be the person who's doing something a bit different, but also inspired by him. I guess the things I'm trying to get at here is attention, noticing, something like thinking of this as a lifetime time aspect, thinking of this as a real lifetime that we're giving to something. How does that sit with you in this project?
We've said so many important things there. I'll just pick up on one or two of them. The question, the thing that you foregrounded about time, I think that that's very, very important. It boils down to some fairly simple things that everybody can relate to, that in the short term, you can avoid something, but in the long term, it's going to bite you in the butt, because if you avoid it, it doesn't make it not be there. It's like the child who closes their eyes, and thinks that because they're not seeing something, it's not there, but it is still there. And so, this idea of a short-term avoidance strategy, for small matters, you can do that, but, for big matters, it's unwise. And because eventually, the chickens will come home to roost. And so this is very important in terms of the treatments that we're talking about, that there are short-term palliative measures that one can take, but in the end, you've got to face the facts and you've got to come to grips with them, and to do so requires effort. And I think that you're linking that with our whole, this kind of like, you can just make it shit up these days, and that's fine, and everyone's got a 15-second attention span, and and so on. These things have consequences too, and we won't get away with it. You can't get away with it. Reality always wins, and so this the approach that we're talking about, I think some people might be surprised to hear this, but my sense is that there's something of the beginnings of a renaissance in terms of this kind of worldview, that many people are turning away from quick fixes and short-termism, because we've seen the consequences on quite a grand scale. Then another aspect of this that you mentioned, when you decide, not only as a person seeking treatment, okay, I'm going to take a deep breath and get to grips with this thing. The same applies from the point of view of the practitioner. When I get a new patient, I have to confess, having done it for decades, I know what it takes, and so I think, do I really want to take this on? Because it's never easy. It requires a lot of work. And so does the business of us cobbling ourselves together. The trying to find a way through life that works for you is hard. And we fortunately are assisted in this by parents when we're little. It's part of the design of the human species, which is a mammal. Little mammals can't look after themselves, so they have to attach to caregivers. And thank God, the caregivers have built into them a nurturant tendency. This is why our species, like other mammal species, why the parents look after the little ones. It's because they care. There's any parent knows, that if your child is in distress, if things are going badly for them, you want to help. And it isn't that you only want to help, okay? Because you also, there's conflict in life. You think sometimes, well, what about mine? I can't just constantly serve yours. And so, but the point I'm leading up to is care. It's Freud said psychoanalysis is a cure by love. And I think that that's a wonderful sort of aphorism or something. It really captures that you have to. This is also why I said earlier that I spoke so much about myself in this book, to demonstrate we're all in this together. The love that Freud is, at least in the way that I'm quoting him here, that he's referring to, it's, there, but by the grace of God goes I. And I know what you're going through because I've been through something like that myself, and so it's from that place that this treatment draws its powers. And I was saying about parents, and that it's under the tutelage of parents that we learn how to meet our needs. And we don't get it right. And so psychotherapy, psychoanalytical psychotherapy in particular, is an opportunity to try again. It's like a reparenting process. And this care thing that I was talking about, it requires a parent will go to the ends of the for their child on average. I mean, there's differences, but I've seen it in my work. I work mostly in neurology and neurosurgery wards where I've seen, what parents are prepared to do for their children. It's really quite something. But we're not prepared to do it for other people's children, and here's what we're talking about. If it's a reparenting process, and this is why I was speaking about the political side of it again, that how much do our so-called leaders care about us? They are responsible for us. And the same applies, to a healthcare provider that you are a customer of, and so on. I think that when it comes to this kind of treatment, this aspect of life, it's about, caring. And there's just no way around that. In fact, it occurs to me as I say that, that something which I don't think I even touched on in the book, but which is becoming increasingly a big thing, is can we provide psychotherapy by means of large language models? Can we sort of farm this out to chatbots? You can just see that coming next, and this is why it comes to my mind here that computers don't give a damn, as Hoblan said. The fundamental place that you need to draw from in order to deliver this sort of treatment, the mutual feeling, that I know what this is like. I've been there too. No chatbot has been there too, so we must be careful about that too. But I've really digressed. The thing about time that the point you made about time is central.
I'm so glad you brought it to care. Also, I mean, we only have like 5 minutes, so I won't go into the AI, but I think I've heard from colleagues you've been working with the AI and thinking about feeling and emotion, and how for me, this relates a lot to the embodied literature too, and how there is something different about a living body, and it does have to do with what we care about. What we're caring towards is how I think of it.
Mm.
And you can tell a lot about how good someone is parenting or caring, whether it's a politician or it's, someone in science or whatever, by what they're caring towards. Maybe that's like getting attention or accolades, or maybe that's helping someone, or, it's just when you get to the basics that way. But it's a very hard basics. I'm so glad you brought it to care, because as I was reading, the last chapter is Cure by Love, I think. Isn't it the last chapter? And cure, and that I started thinking, oh, that's the same root as care in Latin, isn't it? Cura, cara. And so that's like somehow very beautiful, right? Just to let that tension be there of what that is. And I know care and like panskips or, in the emotions could be something else. But in this sense, I think it's something like the caring towards that is why we live, and is even maybe what a cell is doing. If you think of something like Philip Ball's work with meaning, I mean, there's something happening, as you say, where I think we're trying to rediscover this, and it relates a little bit to rediscovering Freud in a new way. But I think before we go, I have to say, one thing that came from reading your book was I started thinking about analysts from a different, this is really hard, because at some point I was thinking, why can't we just do this for each other all the time? Because we get each other in these states of emotion as lovers, as parents, as whatever we are. Why can't we help each other all the time? And then I thought, because it's so exhausting. It's so exhausting. And you have to be in your best self state, which is so hard to be in all the time. And so then I thought, well, as an analyst, you have to sort of be in your best self state, which is impossible, right? All the time. And like you said, that's why it's limited. You can do it, but still, what a toll that must take, and how hard not to get confused about all of that, especially the transference stuff. And just, to me, it seems like if we really think of this in a wider lens about caring, yes, we need psychoanalysis and people who are professionally doing that. But in a way, it's a practice we all sort of start to need to learn how to do and become aware of how revolutionary it is, to go back to what you said about Freud bringing it up, but also a lot of other people who've been trying to do it. So I wonder if you see a way in which we can start to think of it that way. I think you say psychoanalysis is like a cure that comes through loving your neighbor as yourself, right? It seems like such a simple thing, but isn't it like the hardest thing too? Do you see a way in which that connects, or the cure?
I see very, very much what and agree very much with what you're saying. So I said earlier that one of the reasons why we are able to help our patients is because we don't have to live with them, and I mean that very seriously. You have very contained 50 minutes with a person, and where you can be your best self for 50 minutes in that setting in a way that you can't in your ordinary life. But then there is also the fact that we, as part of our training, have to have a lot of treatment ourselves. You have to get to grips with your own automatic ways of responding and catch yourself from doing that in order to be able to do this job properly. It also needs to be said that unlike, say, a mechanic or a dentist or something, the personality of the analyst, unfortunately, is part of their instrument, and so it makes a difference what sort of person you are, and our training analyses go some distance, but if you're not the right sort of person to begin with, so it's not a profession for everyone, and not everyone does it equally well, and that needs to be said. That needs to be said too. Because I'm aware that we're nearly at the end of our time, I want to also link this back to what you were saying about time. A theme in the book that you and I haven't touched on, as far as I'm aware at all in our conversation, is the theme of mortality. And, it's something, when I say that we got to face the facts because they're there, that's one of those facts, that you have a brief period of biological time, and then it ends. And so, what you do with that time, it matters, because at least as far as I can tell, you don't get another shot. So how we use our lives, for me, a very important part of how I've used my life is to try and understand. I said to you that life is about doing, what makes you feel better and avoiding what makes you feel worse. So extrapolating from there, trying to understand what feelings are. What are they for? How do they work? How many different kinds of feelings are there? What are the values that flow from that? And it informs not only how you live your life selfishly, in the sense that, you only call one of them and you want to use it properly, but we are not autists, we're not islands. We are a social species. We're connected to each other, and we have values that relate to that too. Really, we were speaking about care. It's a thing that exists in mammals. That we're connected, and so to immerse yourself in this field. This is the upside of it. The downside of it is the struggle that we were talking about earlier. The upside of it is, this is really and truly, ultimately, what matters. This is what our lives are about, and to try to understand better, more deeply, what these values are, what these things that matter, and why, what they are, and so on. It's a very Freud. I think I quoted it right at the end of the book, a letter that Freud wrote to Einstein, in which he said, I don't think I quoted that part, but Freud says, I wish I was a physicist. Things are so clear cut for you guys, and it's so much easier. And what I'm doing, it's so much more murky and so much more difficult. But then he says that there's nothing richer, nothing deeper, nothing more profound than the life of the mind, and that he doesn't regret having given his life to that subject. And I feel the same way.
That's beautiful. What you just said, it's so rich and so meaningful, and it's really what we're here for. I think that's why the care does feel so constitutive, if I may say, in a way. I really appreciated you more in reading this book than I had even before, because I started to realize you've put so much noticing and time and attention in that nobody's really seen. I mean, all of the time with the Freud, for example, which is a real contribution, right? I mean, that's a contribution just on a literary level, but also with the therapy. So what you're doing kind of behind the scenes, you let us see a little more of that. So I just want to thank you. I just want to, be grateful to you for that. And also for doing this public facing stuff too, which can be very annoying and hard. And also, if there's anything that we haven't talked about, you want to be sure we say, or anything about love that comes up before we go, this is your time.
Thank you, Andrea. I don't think that there's anything that we haven't touched on that I want to squeeze in, under the wire. But I do appreciate very much the way in which you've conducted this conversation. I think that you really got to the sorts of things that I was trying to get to in writing this book. You got to in this conversation. So that's been very gratifying. Thank you. And it seems that it's no accident what the title of your podcast is, because I think that's what we've been talking about. So thank you.
Well, thanks for doing that with me. Thanks for also being someone who's out there talking about these things. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a nice rest of your trip. You're in New York. I keep hearing the sirens on your side and then on my side. So. All right, well, till the next time then, Mark. I look forward. All right, be well.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, everyone, if you made it to the end, here's a little Easter egg poem. It's by Heaney, and it's called From the Cure at Troy. I still haven't seen Odysseus yet, but I'm about to see it, I think. So this seemed, at least in the ballpark, the Homer ballpark. So, but I just thought of it because of the cure that we were talking about. Okay, the cure at Troy. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. History says don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracle and cures and healing wells. Call miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing, double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term.